None of the billions that were being offered were going to the WTA. Companies weren't just chasing Alex Eala. They were skipping the whole tour. A 19-year-old Filipino had surpassed a professional circuit built over 50 years in terms of financial usefulness. Not by dominating the Grand Slam, not by dominating the rankings, but by something much more dangerous to the system. Unbridled cultural attraction. Furthermore, the tennis community did more than just raise eyebrows when the financial figures began to surface. It did not breathe. Because there was no sponsorship story taking place. There was a change in power. A tennis skirt masquerading as a modest corporate revolution. Additionally, the WTA was unaware of its strategy. You'll see why the most important battle in women's tennis at the moment isn't taking place on any court if you stay focused. A particular kind of athlete transcends its sport before it appropriately recognizes them. It was Muhammad Ali. It was Serena Williams. Alex Eala is now completely redesigning their marketing strategies on a scale that includes business boardrooms from Manila to Manhattan, whether or not the WTA institution approves. Eala brought something to professional tennis that no coaching manual teaches. She was born in the Philippines, brought up with strict discipline, and trained at the Rafael Nadal Academy in Morca. Her story connected with billions of people in Southeast Asia, Europe, and America at the same time. It was a true cross-continental, multi-generational story. Long before the rankings caught up, businesses observed what marketing executives covertly refer to as a great cultural convergence brought about by this combination: the underdog location, the elite European training ground, and the contagious personality. Eala's social media following had surpassed that of many players with higher rankings by the time she was making waves on the WTA tour. Her Instagram engagement ratings weren't only impressive for a tennis player. They were powerful enough for any athlete, anywhere in the world, in any sport. Companies are gauging genuine audience engagement by real emotional commitment from authentic communities rather than just follower counts. We are looking at data that prompted their analysts to double-check. Sports companies, high-end watch manufacturers, tech giants, and telecom companies with sizable Southeast Asian customer bases. They weren't just curious. Behind closed doors, they were engaged in fierce competition. Discussions were progressing from tentative discussions to significant cash commitments. Notably, these conversations were not taking place via WTA partnering channels. They were heading straight for Eala's attorney. This distinction is quite significant. The WTA operates using a traditional sports marketing framework. Income models built around the community, official tour partnerships, and centralized sponsorships. For decades, that paradigm worked flawlessly. However, it was designed for a different era, one in which a single athlete might garner more online attention than the entire organization endorsing her. Eala stood for everything that the previous model had failed to take into consideration. A player whose personal brand gravity was completely removing sponsors from the tour's orbit. Just by appearing and engaging with people on a frequency that WTA's institutional voice was unable to match, not by disagreement or conflict. There were more and more murmurs in tennis circles. Brand partners began informing other players' agents that budget allocations were being examined. Rejuvenation recommendations started to get more subdued responses from tournament sponsors. Women's tennis wasn't losing money. It was concentrating on a single, distinct point of cultural gravity. There was a name for that point. There was a backhand to that point that might disrupt conversations. And that was only the beginning. Pose this question to yourself. When was the last time a teenager forced billion-dollar companies to completely reconsider their approach to sports marketing? Since it had already arrived at that point. There is a technique for numbers to get out of rooms. They were never meant to leave. The figures pertaining to Alex Eala's individual sponsorship portfolio that were being discussed in private conversations were not minor endorsement deals. Professional tennis players outside of the top 10 typically get mid-tier settings like this. A type of financial commitment that put a player who was still rising in the rankings in commercial discussions typically reserved for proven Grand Slam champions was reflected in what was disseminated in confidential term sheets in preliminary agreements. According to reports from the sports industry, each brand delivers comparable figures that, when combined throughout numerous partnerships, created a total portfolio value estimated in billions rather than millions when projected over multi-year commitments. According to reports, One of the top contenders was a telecom giant with significant market penetration in Southeast Asia. Numerous sportswear companies entered crucial discussions by interpreting the cultural imprint controlled throughout a big and growing customer population. She was considered indispensable by tech companies looking for genuine ambassador voices in emerging areas. These offers were unique not just because of their size but also because of their structure. Brands weren't contacting a team to see how she fit into the current structures for WTA neighboring partnerships. They were creating whole custom setups, creative collaborations, ownership stakes, and sponsored content initiatives. Long-term ambassador structures that regarded her as more than just an athletic endorsement, but as a media entity. In an interview with industry publications, a sports marketing analyst characterized the situation with startling candor. Brands have made the fundamental decision that going around the tour rather than through it was a more effective way to access the emotional connection you created with the audience. Although useful for reaching sizable tennis audiences, the WTA's official partnership infrastructure was unable to provide the identical profoundly devoted, culturally unique groups that followed you personally. This information had serious financial ramifications for the WTA. The collective loses power when businesses shift sponsorship funds from organizational alliances to individual athlete agreements outside of tour buildings. Visibility is lost for other players. Financial streams are lost in smaller competitions. The burden is felt by the entire ecosystem. This is the aspect that actually made the tension more intense. This situation wasn't engineered by A. She wasn't positioning herself as an enemy of any organization. Her representation was just using the right marketing strategy to address extraordinary market demand. That isn't a revolt. That's business. However, the WTA penalties were the same for all purposes. Tour execs were having heated conversations behind closed doors. When one of its members turns into a more desirable individual investment than the group platform, how can an organization maintain sponsorship significance? In order to accommodate an athlete whose personal audience outweighs institutional reach, how can commercial frameworks designed for a pre-social media environment be reorganized? These were no longer speculative strategic inquiries. They needed answers right away, and the WTA seems to be looking for them far too slowly for reasons that will soon become very apparent. It wasn't whether you deserved these offers that was the billion-dollar question. No one really questioned that. Much more unsettling was the question that was tearing through tennis boardrooms. Could the WTA ever really regain the commercial narrative if they had already lost it? When there is a systemic catastrophe, silence is never really quiet. It conveys everything. The WTA's official communication channels were noticeably quiet as brand talks surrounding Alexia were getting more intense and sports business media was starting to make official connections. There was only institutional inaction at the exact moment when decisive action was most needed. No official admission, no strategic positioning statement, and no clear attempt to reframe the commercial conversation on their terms. And it was horrible to be silent. In today's media landscape, an organization's failure to control its own narrative creates more than just a void. It gives everyone else the microphone. Fan communities across continents, rival sports organizations, tennis writers, and sports marketing analysts all scrambled to fill the interpretive gap left by the WTA. The story being told without them was unflattering. It showed a governing body caught completely off guard by a change that, looking back, had been observed for years. This delayed reaction had complex underlying structural factors. Working across multiple jurisdictions, the WTA concurrently balances conflicting interests from players, competitions, broadcasters, and well-known business partners. In normal circumstances, decision-making within that framework proceeds deliberately because deliberateness demonstrates responsibility governance. However, the circumstances surrounding IA's commercial boom were anything but typical. Speed was essential, adaptation was crucial, and speed wasn't arriving. Meanwhile, individual sponsors, growing wary of the WTA's strategic orientation, began probing talks that months earlier would have been unthinkable. Brands that had maintained stable, mutually beneficial tour partnerships after years were suddenly asking basic questions about return on investment. Were the audiences that brands needed most still being reached by WTA-adjacent positions? Or had those viewers moved away from institutional channels entirely in pursuit of particular athletes, singular experiences, or distinct cultural moments? Tour leadership was really unhappy with the internal responses those brands were getting. Digital analytics are not negotiable. The overwhelming finding of numerous independent commercial studies was consistent, and audience movement data disregards historical relationships. The WTA's ability to reach certain high-value audiences has significantly declined. While ISA's distinct platforms had simultaneously today, players throughout the tour begun seeing the downstream repercussions. Discussions with potential personal sponsors were poignant. WTA alliance alignment was no longer mentioned as a positive indication by brand representatives, or they were framing it with qualifications that had never been used before. The institutional support that had previously increased the commercial value of individual players was beginning to lose some of its allure. Speaking anonymously to sports media, seasoned athletes conveyed sincere annoyance. They had dedicated their lives to enhancing the WTA's overall business standing. For many, the notion that institutional quiet during a crucial period of change might undermine years of teamwork felt like a serious leadership failure that was still unacknowledged. The WTA's lack of communication wasn't just a PR blunder. It served as a warning to all of the corporate partners who are presently assessing their involvement with women's tennis that the organization lacked the awareness or the resolve to manage its own change. That signal held significant weight for sponsors used to collaborating with forward-thinking, strategically articulate organizations. There was a genuine cost associated with each day of institutional stillness, and the bill was mounting quickly. Corporations never use the word withdrawal when they start discreetly reorganizing their financial obligations. It's always softer. Changing investment priorities, portfolio reevaluation, and strategic reallocation. However, the meaning remains the same beneath the meticulous corporate jargon. The funds are flowing. Additionally, it began to move with frightening speed in women's tennis. The departures didn't make a big announcement. Institutional sponsorship erosion never works like that. It occurs as a result of unresolved renewal discussions, option clauses that expire without being activated, and partnership agreements that are merely not renewed with the zeal or at the amounts of money they once demanded. The commercial basis started to reveal fractures gradually, and then all of a sudden, a number of well-known WTA businesses started shifting significant amounts of their sports marketing funds to individual athlete collaborations outside of tour arrangements. From a purely commercial standpoint, the reasoning behind these choices was simple and totally logical. Tour-eyed placement data was consistently exceeded by audience engagement measures around individual players, with EALA being the most notable example, albeit not the only one. The